Welcome back, everybody, to another episode of LBMC Cybersecurity Sense. This is your host, William Parks, and we're back again with another episode. As you could probably guess, it's another PCI requirement. We have Andy Kerr and Kyle Hinterberg on the phone with us today. Gentlemen, how are you guys doing?
Doing pretty
Excellent.
Good. All right. We were a little bit slow last month, but that's okay. We're getting back on track now, and sometimes it's just hit or miss with what goes on schedules. So, as you all could probably assume, these gentlemen are both very busy men, and so we're lucky to have them here today. So, without further ado, won't waste too much time here. We're gonna kick off some news as we usually do. Kyle, I'll let you take over for that.
I think the biggest thing, I think we talked about it last time too, but the news is, 4.0 is around the corner. We're literally now to like the countdown, end of this month is the end of 3.2.1. If you're right now working through an assessment, you better be, get her done quick, essentially, because if it, bleeds over into April, that's when you should be working on a 4.0 assessment. And basically, for Andy and I, every assessment we've been starting for, well over probably the last month or so is all now 4.0 assessments. And so if you haven't, this is like the last chance. Get into, 4.0, see what's going on there and get ready for it.
Absolutely.
And even to add on to that, so even Visa themselves have come out and said they have an official cutoff to say, hey, if there was an assessment that started, at such and such time, their cutoff is, from my contact, is the end of June. So if they have one that kind of, drug on or whatever, they will not take an attestation of compliance anywhere past June. So that's it. So I guess it just depends on how big the environment was and how it was started. But yeah, everybody's going to be cracking down and tightening up.
This time that Jeopardy music's starting. Everyone's eagerly waiting. All right.
And one other piece of news kind of related to 4.0, I think we also might have mentioned this one a couple podcasts ago, kind of talking about requirement 8 and MFA for, multi-factor authentication. And in 4.0, there's, been quite a few changes around it. And if anyone's ever looked, there is an older guidance document. If anyone's not aware, if you go out to the PCI Council's website, they have a bunch of guidance documents that'll help you understand different requirements, give you some background and understanding as far as how to implement them. And they have one on MFA, but if you actually compare it side by side with the new 4.0 requirements, they don't align anymore. And the council's aware of that and they're working to update it. So hopefully within the next few months here, they'll have some new guidance. And so if you've been looking at 4.0 and kind of struggling around, how you need to get that MFA implemented to meet everything they're saying, again, that new guidance doc, once it comes out, should hopefully, give you some clear guidance there. But if you go look at the current guidance doc, don't expect that one to fix your problems because it doesn't really align one-to-one.
Okay. Man, we got a lot of stuff kind of happening. There aren't a whole lot of pieces of news, but it's just a lot of the deadlines are kind of coming to fruition now, and everyone, it's just time to strap up and make sure that you're ready for it. Hopefully you started that by now.
Kind of similar to that MFA guidance, I wouldn't be surprised if in the next, really year here, as all the organizations really hit 4.0 hard and are forced to really work through it, if you start hearing about some errata and guidance and whatnot from the council as they figure out, like, hey, we told people to do this, but we found out you really can't, or this is too difficult, or, I'm expecting you might see some minor changes, and, by next year there might be version 4.0.2 or something like that to, have those tweaks.
Sweet. And I'd assume that as those changes come about, we'll probably be mentioning those on this podcast, I'd assume. So if you guys are wanting to keep up with that, make sure you do follow this podcast and everything that gets pumped out, because these men are always spitting some game. So it's always a good time to be able to hear what's going on in the world. So without further ado, we'll go ahead and hit the requirement for today. So ladies and gentlemen, today is requirement 10. Logging and monitoring all access to system components and cardholder data. So that's a big slew of words. I'm ready to have it broken down. Let's eat and digest.
Go ahead, Andy.
I was going to say, the thing is, we have been covering, some of the new pieces. And again, requirement 10 does have some new requirements and new, sections there that, but I feel like that they've almost become more clarifications on existing requirements for the most part. And I think along with that piece, I want to mention requirement 10. Most people these days, most major entities have some sort of SIM, one way or another. Um, but I think there's a really misconception of this kind of plug and play kind of attitude toward the SIM. Well, we just plug it in, we put in the IP addresses for what we need to be watching, and we'll just let it go. And I feel like sometimes this gets dropped. Over a small thing. So in Kyle, you can kind of give me your input of what you've seen. But in a lot of my clients, when I'm looking through here, I'm looking for logging. I'll grab a handful of hey, all right, here's you've got several hundred Windows devices. I'm just going to grab a couple here and a firewall and a couple of things here, and I'm just going to do some spot checking to make sure that I'm seeing the logs come through. And it's very easily missed. Somehow or another, one device or two devices or a sample of devices are not logging to the SIM. And I found this more often than not, at least for a category of devices. And so this is very important, as part of 4.0. One of the review processes is, looking at hardware and software and looking at, your scope itself. And there's all these new requirements in regards to scoping. I would highly recommend, even though it is not a requirement, that it doesn't say you have to have an official review of your SIM, but I would highly recommend that during the year, clients, merchants, service providers, that you're actually going out there, grab a handful of devices and go in there and do a more formalized review, making sure that you're seeing those types of devices logging. Because there's nothing worse than sitting there, you're with the logging team and you're asking for a couple of IP addresses to be pulled up, and all of a sudden there's just nothing. There's no data, no nothing, and everybody starts panicking like, what happened? And they come to find out, well, 6 months ago we made a major change and nobody added these systems back in. So before we kind of jump down this rabbit hole of logging, I highly recommend that merchants and service providers out there that are listening to the podcast, make sure you're doing some sort of formalized review of your logging systems and making sure that those devices, all your different types of devices, are actually logging.
I totally agree with that. And kind of on that same vein, I feel like something that doesn't always happen is making sure you have team members who are, kind of focused and understand your SIM. Because
Yes.
to the same, just like you were saying, Andy, I feel like it's a little bit, hey, we just bought, Splunk and we're throwing the money at it, or we bought Logarithm, or, whatever the tool is, they plug it in, fire everything over there, and then they maybe forget about it. And they're good, as far as they're logging all this stuff, but really all that data is going to ever do is if they get breached or something horrible happens, they have all that historic forensic data, but they're not really using it in a timely manner. And, I love it when I'm doing an interview and you find someone who actually knows like Splunk foo, and they can, type all the commands and tell you everything. And it's like, you actually understand what's going on. You can pull this up. You can show me all the PCI servers, whatever. And it's like, that's awesome. That's the type of people you really want to have your logs, and to make it so your logs aren't just a checkbox like, oh yeah, we're compliant because we have a SIM. Actually, put them to use. Make sure that you're getting information. Make sure they're sending you relevant alerts. Don't just do this because PCI or any other compliance obligation tells you that you have to.
Yeah, 100%. And all this whole conversation, goes in kind of, one of the new requirements that kind of has kind of come into play. And I will say I haven't run into too many entities that have this, and specifically this is 10.4.1.1. This is all about the you have to have an automated mechanism used to perform your audit log reviews. So and Kyle, I don't know if you've I haven't run into too many people that have a manual process of going through their log reviews. I mean, there's always that possibility, but
I had one client once that
okay.
did that, and they had a very small environment of like 5 servers, and they claimed they did that. But even with that, in my opinion, I don't really believe that you can do a good job without some type of an automated system. And even if it's not, all the dollar signs that you need to get Splunk, there are, free or, minimal type solutions that you can leverage to help you out.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. And again, it doesn't happen often, but every now and again, you'll run across somebody that says they do manual review, and you kind of have to hold their feet to the fire there.
I'm not gonna lie to you. It
And
reminds me of somebody back in college. I had a professor who worked on networking for the university. And I kid you not, I walked out, saw him one day having coffee, and he had the fattest stack of logs printed out on paper that he was reading it like a newspaper. And he was flipping, and I was like, "What are you doing?" He's like, "Oh, I do this every morning." I'm like, "Okay."
that's insane.
Wow,
That's pretty
that is
pretty
nuts. I can't
dedicated
even
there.
imagine.
You know, so,
That's just the problem is even for a small environment, basically, and again, PCI now removes this option, but it would be either you purchase a sim or you hire an employee who does nothing but read logs every day. And even at that, even if you can read logs, can you read logs and understand them from Windows, from Linux, from Palo Altos, from Cisco? All these
absolutely.
devices spit out logs in different means. And also, can you correlate all of that together? Can you tell, hey, this Windows server got hit the same time this firewall got hit, and that means something's happening? Those are
Right.
the types
Right.
of things that you really need a sim to help you with.
Yeah. Helps you
Exactly.
visualize all that stuff. Perfect. Sorry, I didn't mean to take us off
Yeah.
track there, but I thought that was funny when we were talking about manual review. It just reminded me of that. I haven't seen someone do that in a while.
And there is still with that, even though you now need an automated system, you still have to do the daily log review. But the thought there is, again, you're not going through and reading every single one of your billion logs that are coming in. You have a solution, such as a sim. That's really what most everyone is going to be using. But some type of a log collection tool that then goes through and identifies, basically based on its own algorithms, machine learning, etc., where it thinks there's problems. Maybe you set up alerts that if someone tries to get into a system and it has 3 bad password entries or something like that, that generates an alert. And then you have to have, an individual or more likely a team of individuals that are reviewing all of those alerts. So that way they're responded upon appropriately. That's where now that daily log review comes into. It's not really daily log review. It's more so daily alert review of your log system. And
Yeah, and
go ahead.
good, good, Kyle.
I was just going to say, kind of tying into that, it's another part of one of the new requirements, and it's still a little bit old. There's always been a requirement that for that daily log review, it's really only for your critical systems and systems that are like in your cardholder data environment, and kind of your secondary systems don't necessarily need to have daily log review. But you've always had to do log review at some period and kind of document that yourselves. Now, that's one of the places where there's one of those new targeted risk analysis processes that comes into play, where you have to perform a targeted risk analysis, say, hey, for all of our kind of secondary systems, they're not directly critical to the security, they're not in the CDE. For all those systems, maybe we review those alerts weekly. In my experience, it's rare that people do that. Generally, all alerts just kind of get bulked together, and everyone reviews them as they're coming up. But there is that option, and to do that TRA to then give kind of 2 log review time periods.
And the question has come up, and several folks are like, okay, well, wait a minute. So you're talking about all logging, we're all critical systems, and logging with our CDE and our logging of our, anything that would be important. And then these other logs. Well, what logs are those? What would those be exactly? And I've had this question a couple of times, and I'm like, that sounds like everything when you're saying critical systems. And so one of those things that could be potentially that could fall into that category that it isn't necessarily a part of the CDE. It's not part of the segmentation of the CDE or the security of the CDE. Could be something like your administrative workstations. So they are in scope. They're not a part of that. They're not part of the CDE. They're not part of the segmentation of the CDE or the alerting of the CDE. So those those particular logs could fall into that category.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that makes sense. And to your point, my general default is just look at all those alerts daily, and ideally, have someone, possibly work with the sim company that you have to really tune it well. That's the number one thing, is to tune your sim and
Oh
try
yeah.
to get, relevant, actionable alerts. If you're getting, 100 alerts a day that are all just like, oh yeah, that's nothing, delete it, that's useless. You really want actionable alerts that when you get it, it tells you some information that, either something's going on or something, should be changed, whatever that is, to really try to get to that point. And then ideally you should just be able to do that, across your environment and not have to worry too much about what's critical, what's not critical.
Yeah. And speaking of critical, I think in my opinion, um, two of the biggest changes to requirement 10 are right at the dead end of it, and that's 10.7.1 and 10.7.2. So this is kind of interesting to where um, the 10. Excuse me, not 10.7.1, 10.7.2 and 10.7.3. Sorry, the numbering is getting me off. So basically, what this says is where this was applicable to service providers in the past. What PCI did is they got very granular about what exactly is it that they're talking about and made this applicable to both merchants and service providers. And what this is, and this is a little bit of misconception when I start talking to this, talking about failures of any of these critical security controls. Well, the first thing everybody says, well, yeah, we get alerts and we get this and we get that. Well, it's not necessarily talking about alerts. Say you're getting an IDS IPS alert or you're getting some sort of anti-malware alert. This is if those systems actually go down. So these things fail, you lose an index on your SIM. The big thing is how are you guys getting notified of this? How is this happening? First of all, how was it detected? And what PCS is detected, alerted, and how was it addressed promptly? And so what we found is, and what I have found the most advantageous is there really should be playbooks that address these specific issues. And you can kind of see, even if you go through 10.7.2, you'll see it kind of a breakdown. It'll say network security controls, which, by the way, does not just mean firewalls and routers. That can be anything that is being utilized to segment your CDE. So it's not specifically just firewalls and routers anymore. It can be a lot of other things: IDS, IPS, physical access controls. Hey, our card reader went down on our data center. How were we alerted? How do we know about it? How do we address it? Like I said before, the index. So this is a big one. The reason I say this, it's not so much something that entities are not already doing, but actually putting it down in documentation, having it written out to say, if our SIM goes down, these are the steps that we will take, and this is where those playbooks come into play.
So it's like
Yeah,
having
I would
that
totally
backup
agree
plan.
that 9 times out of 10, organizations have monitoring tools, SIMs, etc., things that are doing these things, but they haven't really thought through it. And to your point, Andy, it's not really called out here, but to do this well, it almost has to start with like a risk assessment where you're
Yes.
saying, here's our critical systems, here's how they could fail. If that happened, here's how we would identify it. And that's what you need for, 10.7.2 and 10.7.3 is those parts. Here's what they are, here's what it looks like, because like a question I've asked clients before is like, if your firewall just failed open, how would you know? How would you ever
Right.
know that it just all of a sudden any's everything? And that's a hard question to ask, but trying to figure out those types of things, if that failed, how would you be able to identify it? And then how would you fix it? That's what this requirement is looking for.
Absolutely. And the second part of this is the 10.7.3. And this is something that can be easily overlooked or skimmed. Hey, no, we got alerted that our SIM went down. We responded. We got it back up. We have a playbook that tells us exactly how to do that. Okay, great. How was that documented? And 10.7.3 really calls you out, as far as, whatever ticketing system, that internal entity uses. This really needs to be addressed the right way. And it sets out a set of bullet points, how did you get restore the security function? How long was it down? What was the cause of it? Were there any security issues that happened while it was down? Is there going to be any further action that's required? How do we prevent this from happening in the future? And back up to resuming monitoring of security controls. So this can be something I feel like is not detailed enough in a lot of tickets that I see, but these really do need to be addressed, and because now PCI is calling them out, specifically.
Yeah, I totally agree. And like my general, recommendation when I, working with clients to like implement this style of control is, leverage your incident response plan. That's what you really should be doing basically. Is if
Absolutely.
if you find, hey, my firewall failed, use that as, make sure you're hitting the required bullet points for, 10.7, but, leverage your incident response plan, make sure that covers it. And that's really how you, ideally make sure you're hitting these failures of critical security controls. It's kind of that risk assessment. Here's what happens. Now we hit an incident response, deal with it, make sure you're recovered and good to go. But really, in my opinion, anytime a critical security control system fails, regardless of PCI, you should probably be classifying that as an incident.
Absolutely. Absolutely. 100% agree.
And so both of you guys are saying that with the 10.7.2 and 10.7.3, those kind of procedures can be buffed out via a risk assessment if you haven't thought about those.
Possibly to a degree,
Okay.
the risk assessment, and I think I think Kyle was alluding to this. The risk assessment would be the first step in the right direction.
Gotcha.
It'd be like identifying those pieces, knowing everything that he kind of mentioned there, but then taking it one step further for the risk assessment and actually creating playbooks for the SOC to be able to address these issues and make sure that they're well documented. I mean, I always use the reference just like this. If Bob walks out of the office and quits on the spot, and they hire John here, the brand new guy who's, never worked in a SOC before. How does he know what to do? How does he know who to contact?
Right, yeah.
And I always think of, it is, the SOC is, and I'm not trying to try to say that the SOC is just a help desk, but that is that front line of, hey, we need to get incident response going. How do we do that? We've got to have a playbook. We've got to have a path to get this thing back up and going again and find out why it happened.
Yeah, it does nothing but help your efficiency. You'd be able to get going much faster. That makes sense, yeah. Okay, another question here for you. So if let's say I had a company and we were to switch SIMs or log collectors, what would kind of happen if we underwent that process? If we wanted to switch vendors or switch different products that could be used, what would that process kind of look like as far as it goes with all this stuff?
Overall, it shouldn't make too big of a difference. Probably the biggest thing that I've seen clients run into problems with is making sure they have the ability to retain their data, because that's one of the requirements. It hasn't changed for 4.0, but you need to be able to have 3 months of your log data that's readily available. That basically means you can go up and within, minutes, or, it can be a little bit longer than that, but you can log into a portal and access your log data for at least 3 months worth of history. And then you ultimately need to have at least 12 months on some way that you can get it back. That can be even cold storage. If it takes a day or two to pull back that 12 months, that's okay. Again, most organizations just enable 12 months in whatever sim they have and just keep that live. But as long as you're able to maintain that when you switch to a new solution, you're okay. But that's where sometimes organizations can kind of run afoul. It's like, hey, Splunk is too expensive. We're going to turn that off and we're going to turn on this new solution. And now you only have 2 months of logs because you lost Splunk. Or even if you downloaded all your logs from Splunk, do you have a way to actually, rehydrate them and use them? Or are they now, locked in some proprietary format where even though you have them, they're useless? Those are things you need to be thinking about when you're switching to a different log collector.
And on top of that, keep in mind is that now PCI has defined what is a significant change. There are a multitude of additional requirements that will apply to a situation. If you had to swap out a SIM, throughout the year, then that entity needs to go back and look at all the requirements that apply to significant change. There are additional things that you need to do. And in the past, it was a little bit in the gray area as what constitutes a significant change. That is no longer. At the top of the DSS now for 4.0, PCI has said this is a significant change. And if you were to swap out a SIM, that would definitely be included.
Okay. So because I'm not super well versed in SIMs, would it make sense to bring on the new SIM and have it working simultaneously with the old one and comparing results from both of those to see if they're catching the right stuff?
Yeah. It could. I've seen, or I'm right now working with a client that's doing exactly that.
Okay.
And so that's not unheard of. I would say long term, you probably don't want to do that because most SIMs, not all, but most cost dependent on how much you're sending them.
Oh, I can
and so
imagine.
you're basically doubling your cost at that point. So I would only do that on, like a trial basis, maybe do that for a month or something to make sure everything's good. But that's going to be your biggest problem there is cost.
Okay. So if you're trying to blow
And
cash, go ahead and do it, guys. If you're just trying to blow some cash out the window, let it rip.
that's just it. And like the other thought too is like if your environment's in AWS or any other cloud environment, a lot of them charge based on your transmissions as well. And so there again, you'd be doubling the amount of transmission. So that's from a technical standpoint, it makes perfect sense. But from a cost standpoint, it might not.
Right.
Right.
Okay. That makes tons of sense. Thank you. Well, folks.
I would say,
go ahead.
I was just going to say, other than what we talked about, requirement 10 has really stayed the same. No other main big changes. The kind of the high level look at it, and this is the same as it always has been. If you're logging all your critical systems, systems in your CDE, systems that store cardholder data, logging all that access, you are the one thing that's a little bit not log related exactly, but you're managing your time. And that's really just to make sure your logs are accurate, making sure that you have, a solid time source. All your systems should be getting their time from the same time source. If you have multiple time sources, they're peered. So that way everything is the same. And really the goal there is, again, that way, when you're going back in your sim and looking at all your different logs, that, you can sync and correlate logs across the board. And then the last thing is just that, again, the failures of critical security control systems. Those are kind of the 3 parts of requirement 10. And outside of what we chatted through, the only other thing, which I'm sure everyone's aware of by now, is the first one, roles and responsibilities. That's obviously a big one. That's the only other 4.0 change, is make sure you have, your logging responsibilities well-defined. And like Andy was just saying, when it comes to who's doing what in the SOC, if you do involve, some of your risk personnel, if you involve your incident managers, all of that kind of falls into requirement 10. And so it makes sense to review those responsibilities and just make sure, who's doing what.
And on top of that, make sure that if your ROC is coming up and you're using some sort of third-party service provider that monitors, your SIM, and they have the total control of the SIM, make sure that they're going to be in compliance. Make sure that it's part of your third-party service provider management, that you're touching base with them. Hey, when does your 4.0 rock up? When are you guys going to be compliant? This and this and that, and making sure that you have that to kind of correspond with the SIM and the monitoring. And you're not going to miss a beat, and when the auditor starts asking for okay, this is your MDR here. Your SIM monitor, making sure that we have their AOC and everything's looking good and they're compliant with 4.0 as well.
Perfect. Awesome. Well, that's a wrap. Let's go. Requirement 10, folks. We did it. We've done it. On to requirement 11 next month. Thank you for listening. Thank you both for your time and for being here today. And
absolutely
looking forward to another episode here right next month. So thank you guys for listening, and we will catch y'all next month.